What does Daniel have in common with Isaiah, the Apostle Paul, and the beloved disciple John? Well, all four of those men had a magnificent experience in which they had a vision of Jesus himself. Even though Daniel chapter 10 does not reveal the name of the one whom Daniel sees, we can compare his experience with that of specifically Paul and John, in which there was a positive ID given on the one whom they saw, and we can conclude that the Messiah is the one that Daniel sees in chapter 10. In the previous chapter, the archangel Gabriel revealed the prophecy of the 70 weeks to Daniel. This was indicating the timeline up to Messiah. It is this Messiah that Daniel sees in chapter 10. Let's go ahead and get started. Daniel 10:1 reads, "In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. And the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision." Notice the timestamp on this chapter is the third year of Cyrus. If we compare that to the timestamp on Daniel 9:1, that one was the first year of Darius. So quite some time has transpired since his prophecy of the 70 weeks that he received from Gabriel. Something was revealed unto Daniel. Now, the details of chapter 10 primarily involve Daniel's vision of the Holy One. The message that was given to Daniel is detailed in chapters 11 and 12. Daniel understood this message that was given him. That's not always the case. Sometimes he would receive a vision and he would wrestle with it. He got sick sometimes, sick at heart, trying to understand the things that he received. But he understood what was given to him in Daniel 10, 11, and 12. However, the time appointed was long. This, like many other prophecies in Daniel, are for the time of the end. Now, verse 2 says, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine into my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And in the 24th day of the first month, I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel." So Daniel had been mourning, fasting, and praying for 3 full weeks. Now, he was eating, he just wasn't eating choice foods. It says he did not anoint himself, so he wasn't putting on his lotions. He was in a state of humility and submission, much like he was in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel was by the river Hiddekel, as the King James Version says. Hiddekel is the Hebrew name of the Tigris River. The Tigris River is revealed in Genesis 2 to be one of the four main headwaters coming out of the Garden of Eden. So Daniel is in a very special place, receiving a very special vision. So Daniel sees a holy one. Let's look at the details of who it was that he saw, starting here in verse 5. "Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. His body was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude." Now, these details reveal the identity of the one whom Daniel saw. So let's look carefully at each detail. Daniel saw one like a man. This man was clothed in linen. His body was girded in gold. And his body, Daniel describes, was like a beryl. A beryl is a precious stone or a precious gemstone. His face was like lightning. His eyes were like lamps of fire. His arms and legs were like brass. And when he spoke, his voice was like the voice of a multitude. This vision that Daniel has is very similar to John's experience as he describes in Revelation chapter 1. So let's read the details of the one whom John saw in the great revelation or the apocalyptic book at the end of the Bible. John writes, "And in the midst of the seven candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man." So John sees one which he describes as the Son of Man, and Daniel saw one in chapter 10 which he describes as a man. John says he was clothed with a garment down to the foot. Now, he doesn't specifically tell us he was clothed in linen, but Daniel comments that the one whom he saw was clothed in linen. John writes, he was girt about the paps with a golden girdle. So John describes his garment plus his golden girdle. Recall that Daniel saw one whose loins were girded in gold. John writes, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. Recall that Daniel says that his eyes were like lamps of fire. So the details that Daniel is describing are the same as the details that John writes in the book of Revelation. John continues, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. Well, what did Daniel say? Daniel described the one whom he saw as having arms and legs like burnished brass or blazing bronze, very similar to John's description. John says that the one whom he saw had a voice as the sound of many waters. Now, if you think about the way the ocean sounds as the waves roar into the shore, or even the sound of a rushing river going through a rocky crevice, or even the sound of a stadium filled with people, sometimes that sounds like rushing water, right? The sound like what you hear at the Super Bowl. John's describing the voice of the one who spoke to him as the sound of many waters. And Daniel says his voice is like the voice of a multitude. Again, the sound of rushing waters and the sound of a multitude cheering in a crowd, those are similar sounds. John writes in Revelation 1, and he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength. So John says his face was like the sun. And what does Daniel say? But his face was like lightning. So there's a lot of similarities between the one whom Daniel saw, who is not named in Daniel 10, very similar to the one whom John saw, who is named in Revelation 1. We know that John specifically saw Jesus. The one whom John sees reveals himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the one who is dead but who is alive forevermore. Specifically, it was Jesus. So, based on the similar description, we might hypothesize that the one whom Daniel is seeing in chapter 10 is Jesus himself. Now, it may be surprising to you to find out Jesus makes a cameo here in Daniel 10, but this is not the first time we've seen Jesus alluded to in Daniel 10. Recall in Daniel chapter 2, the rock not cut out with human hands is representative of Christ, who is consistently referred to as a rock in both the Old and New Testaments. We saw the fourth man in the fiery furnace protecting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was one like the Son of Men. That possibly is a reference to Jesus. We saw an angel in the lion's den with Daniel. Perhaps it was an angel of the Lord, such as Gabriel or some other powerful angel protecting Daniel from the lions. Or perhaps it was the angel of the Lord, the one whom we saw in the burning bush, the one whom Joshua encountered before entering the promised land. It's quite a possibility that the angel in the lion's den was Jesus himself. We don't know. It's speculation. But in Daniel 7, very positively, we saw a Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, receiving power and glory and dominion. Jesus refers to himself as that Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So we can definitely say that Jesus appears in Daniel chapter 7. And of course, the previous chapter, Daniel 9, the 70 weeks, that was all about Jesus. So it's no surprise in Daniel 10 that Daniel is blessed and privileged to experience this encounter with a holy one who is very likely Jesus. Now, let's see how Daniel reacts in verses 7 through 9. The text says, and I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone, and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me. For my comeliness was turned into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the voice of his words, and when I heard the voice of his words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face was toward the ground. So Daniel has this experience. He was by the river Hiddekel, which, by the way, if we check out our maps, the river Hiddekel is also known as the Tigris River. Again, Hiddekel is the Hebrew word for Tigris. But you can see it here on this map of the Fertile Crescent. It passes through Nineveh. And if we look at a modern day map of the Middle East, it goes through Baghdad, it goes through Mosul, which is, again, modern day Nineveh. And so he was located along that river. Very special place, again, referred to in the Garden of Eden. He was with men at the time, but they did not see the vision. Instead, they were overcome with fear and they ran away. Now, we have hypothesized that the one whom Daniel is seeing is Jesus himself, based on the similarities of John's vision of Jesus in Revelation 1. But we can also compare Daniel's experience to Paul's experience in having a vision of Jesus. Recall that when Paul was traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus, before he converted to a Christian, at the time that he had this experience on the road to Damascus, he was leaving Jerusalem with letters of authority to go and apprehend Christians in Damascus and bring them home and throw them into prison. It was on this mission that Paul has this incredible experience detailed in Acts chapter 9. It says, and as he journeyed, this is Paul, came near Damascus, suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth. Remember, Daniel falls to the ground in his experience as well. Paul says, I heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus. Okay, we've got a positive ID here. The one whom Paul saw on the road to Damascus specifically was Jesus. Um, and Paul, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood by speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. So Paul saw this light from heaven. He saw Jesus. He heard him speak. He interacted with him. But the men that were with Paul were speechless. They heard something, but they couldn't see anything. It says, Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. So this specific experience was individually for Saul, later known as Paul. The men with him were trembling and astonished. They didn't see, even though they did hear. Recall that with Daniel's experience, a great quaking overcame the men that were with him, and they fled away. So Daniel's experience is very similar to John's in Revelation 1 and Paul's here in Acts 9. We know specifically that John saw Jesus, and here Paul saw Jesus. Therefore, we can say it's very likely that the one whom Daniel sees is also Jesus. Now, let's see what happens after his vision of holiness. I'm going to read verses 8 and 9. It says, Therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me, for my comeliness was turned into corruption, and I retained no strength. So, in particular, Daniel says his comeliness was turned into corruption. This is the experience of a fallen, sinful human in the presence of a holy God, a holy and perfect God. Daniel loses all strength and he falls with his face to the ground. Now, we can compare Daniel's experience with Isaiah's. Isaiah also was privileged to have a vision of the Lord on his throne in Isaiah 6. Isaiah writes, In the year that King Uzziah died, I also saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Now, a seraph is an angel very near to the presence of God on his throne. Seraph in Hebrew actually means burning one. So they are full of light, full of power, very near the throne of God. Seraph is singular. Seraphim in Hebrew is plural. So above it stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Think about the rumbling that is experienced in heaven because of God's powerful voice as it emanates from his throne. Well, what did John say? John said his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. Daniel says his voice was like the voice of a multitude. So God has a thunderous and powerful voice. Uh, Isaiah responds, Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of the hosts. So Isaiah becomes overwhelmed with his own evilness, his own sinfulness, and he admits, Woe is me, I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips. Well, what did Daniel experience? Daniel says, My comeliness, anything that was good in me that I saw as comely or beautiful, was turned into corruption. Corruption is death and decay. And it's in stark contrast to the holiness and purity and beauty and perfection of the Lord. So Isaiah responds, Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips, because he had seen the Lord.